Hello, welcome back to another episode of Dr. Supercoach YouTube. You're on again with Pig Mentality, and I'm back to give you my captain recommendations for round 8. By now, you should know where to find me. I'm on Twitter at pig_DRSC. I'm in the Dr. Supercoach Slack for our Patreon members, or down in the YouTube comments below. Have a chat in there and I'll try and get back to you. Remember to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on any Dr. Supercoach videos. For the captaincy last week, as I said, I was supremely confident in a Max Gawn VC and he didn't let me down. So I just took that on the Wednesday night, put the feet up, didn't even have to worry about it. This week, we have some nice matchups from some of our Uber premiums that I'm looking to target, but they're more on the Saturday and Sunday. So I'm actually going to be saving my VC for those games rather than spending them on the Thursday, Friday. So let's get into the content so you can make up your own mind about who to vice captain or captain. My number 3 vice captain recommendation is Nick Daicos. So Nick Daicos has had an inconsistent role to start the season. He's had centre bounce attendances ranging from 26% up to 88%. So he's kind of been thrown around a bit in the season. There's been a bunch of games where he's kind of been in that 55 to 60% CBA role. That's kind of where he's played a bit, but he has had a 26% game. He's had an 88% game. And the reason I say this and kind of point out that's relevance is because Carlton are the third hardest matchup for inside midfielders over the last 5 games, but they're a neutral matchup for opposition designated kickers over that same time. So I guess it depends where Nick lines up this week in terms of how he might score. So if Nick Daicos goes into the back line and takes kickouts, I think he could be on for a big one here against Carlton. They have given up some good scores to defenders, but if he plays on ball, it may be a bit tougher. Adding to that, he only averages 81 against Carlton from his 4 career games. So I guess having said that, though, this is Nick Daicos. Nick's a big game player. There could be over 80,000 people at the G on the Friday night to watch this blockbuster. He should do well regardless. And as I said, you can VC Nick if you like his upside. I wouldn't use the captaincy on him just because of that Carlton matchup. And if he does play inside mid, it might be a bit difficult. But feel free to VC him if you think he might be going to the back line and kind of sneaking a few of those kickouts. It could be a good matchup. Just depends on where he lines up, really. My number 2 recommendation for vice captain is Zach Butters. Coming off his worst game of the season, Zach needs a bounce back this week. Despite a hot start to the season, it sounds pretty crazy saying he needs a bounce back when he's been one of the best players in the game, but last week was not good for him. A showdown matchup versus Adelaide on Thursday night should be all the motivation he needs. Adelaide's midfield mix has improved over the last few weeks, but they're still a positive matchup for opposition inside midfielders. The opposition inside midfielders are still scoring well against Adelaide. Butters is one of the best inside midfielders in the league. It isn't confirmed at the time of recording, but it's likely that Connor Rozee will miss this game, which means that Butters will fill in as Port Adelaide's captain. Zach only scored 79 in the showdown in round 3 last year, but he did score a 134 towards the end of the season against the Crows in 2023. So for this one, the data and the past history, it doesn't look very enticing for Zach Butters in this game, but I'm going to put my faith in Zach's 2024 form and the fact that he will likely be captaining this team in a primetime Thursday night game on national TV. I don't think you need much more motivation than that, so I think this is a good VC choice. It's not my number 1 though. This is my number 1 VC choice, Harry Sheezel. Harry. What a start to the season for this second-year player. It's amazing to think that he's played less than 30 career games. 7 scores over 108 to start the year, with 4 of them being over 120. This week he matches up with St Kilda, who give up the most points this season to wingers, general defenders, and opposition designated kickers. So if you're playing kind of that loose winger or half-back role, you are absolutely feasting against St Kilda this year. So that screams perfection for Sheesel, who's North Main's accumulator off the back line. The only flag here is that Alistair Clarkson has stated that they plan to move Harry further up the ground into a midfield forward role as the season goes on, and you don't want to have the captaincy on him when that game eventually comes. Sheesel doesn't play until the 4th game of the round, and there probably will be coaches that have used their VC by then, and I don't think many will outright captain him, with those comments from Clarko. So if you want to go against the pack and save your vice captain for the second highest averaging defender against the best matchup in the league, I could see a huge score here for Sheesel if he does play in defence all game. 126 and 110 in his 2 matchups against the Saints previously, and they were both in his rookie year. So I think this one is worth saving your VCs for. I would pass on Nick Daicos and Zach Butters or people in those first few games to save it for Sheesel. Then we go to my point of difference, vice captain or captain. So this is one that he might be owned by a few people, but I really don't think there will be any people thinking about the vice captain or captain with this guy, and I think I want to put it into your consideration. That is Brody Grundy. So why am I recommending Brody Grundy as a vice captain after he struggled to get an 83 last week? There are 2 main things I look at when I analyse a ruckman's draw. Their direct opponent ruckman and the venue. So let's talk about the venue first, the SCG. Grundy averages 129 points across his entire career at the SCG. That's his most productive ground for him in terms of SuperCoach scoring. And this season, Brody is averaging 132 at the SCG and 90 away from the SCG. That is an insane discrepancy, and one that I think he does continue this week. The second reason I think he keeps up that score is his opponent. Kieran Briggs has been the easiest matchup for opposition ruckman in 2024. He's given up the most, essentially, points based, opposed to their average. So Briggsy, he only wins the hit out in 38% of his ruck contests this season, which is the 3rd worst in the league. So when a ruckman only wins the hit out in 38% of their ruck contests, that leaves plenty of hit outs available for their opponent, or in this case, for Brody Grundy. Additionally, the SCG is known for being a smaller ground, and it has more stoppages per game than other larger grounds like the MCG. I did double check that in the off-season. Shout out to Jaden Poposky, sent me some data on stoppages per ground, and SCG is one of the highest in terms of having stoppages. And what more stoppages means is more opportunities for hitouts, tackles, and clearances for the ruckman. For the midfielders as well, but I do love it for the ruckman, the SCG in particular. So when you combine the perfect venue with the perfect opposition matchup, it is kind of hard to ignore Brody Grundy as a VC option this week. I don't expect many serious SuperCoach players to look at Grundy, especially coming off an 83. So if you want a pod vice captain, this is the one. We now go to my captains, my top 5 captains, and we'll start with Caleb Sarong. So Caleb Sarong comes into this game averaging over 128 points. And now he gets a matchup with Richmond, who are near the bottom of the ladder, and they have most of their main midfielders out with injuries. That sounds like a perfect matchup, yeah? Well, I thought so as well, but I do have some flags. Over the last 5 games, the Tigers haven't been as bad as we first thought. They're actually ranking as a neutral matchup for inside midfielders. On top of that, Marlon Pickett tagged Christian Petrarca to a 93 last week, and that tag risk is very relevant for Sarong. Sarong, who most people would agree is Fremantle's most important player this year. But Richmond have been a bit inconsistent, so which Richmond will we get this week? Will we get the Richmond of last week, or the Tigers of last week, who played Melbourne, and they kept all demon midfielders below 95? Is that the Richmond we're going to get? Or are we going to get the Tigers, who gave up 157 to Yeo, 129 to Kelly, and 108 to Reid only a fortnight earlier? So it's a bit of a gamble about which Richmond Sarong plays against. And also the unknown tag risk is kind of why he's down here at my number 5 captain options. He would have been much, much higher if Marlon Pickett didn't tag Christian Petrarca last week, essentially. My gut feeling is that Sarong isn't tagged, or if he does, he kind of just breaks through and still dominates. Some guys saying in Slack that actually Carlton tried to tag Sarong earlier in the year, and he just went out to a wing and still absolutely racked up and kind of broke that tag. So that's obviously a chance as well. So this one, you can have a crack at it if you want for a big ceiling score if he isn't tagged. The big ceiling score, for example, Zach Butters, a similar type of player. I believe he scored about 175 against Richmond at the MCG only a few weeks ago when he wasn't tagged. So that is kind of the upside for Sarong in this game. One thing you could try and think about do you have a late enough loophole to VC it? I know it's a Sunday. It's kind of risky doing a VC on a Sunday. But if you have a captain playing after him and a loophole playing after him as well, I would love to VC Caleb Sarong in this one, and that kind of just removes the tag risk and it doesn't matter if he gets tagged because he's just your VC. So that's something to think about as well. Then number 4, we go to Zack Merrett. So on paper, Zack Merrett against West Coast may look like a slam dunk captain choice, but we need to look deeper into West Coast this season. The Eagles midfield has actually improved considerably in 2024 to the point where they're actually now a neutral matchup for opposition inside midfielders after being the easiest matchup in the league last year. The combination of Elliot Yeo, Harley Reid, Ruben Jimby and Tim Kelly has been limiting opponents at the stoppages. Where they do continue to struggle is in transition, and that's to the hard-running midfielders that rack up around the ground. And that is where Zack should be able to score plenty of points, pushing back to help his defenders and getting forward to hit the scoreboard. Tuke Miller and Noah Anderson were able to take advantage of this last weekend, and they both had monster scores. So that's a possibility here with Zack. I'm probably not willing to bet on a Merrett 140 here, just because West Coast have kind of limited teams at the stoppages. But I do, with that, running ability he has, able to get free, I still think this is a safe 120 fullback option. So this one's kind of the opposite of the Sarong recommendation. I think Sarong could be a 90 if he's tagged, or he could be a 170 if he's not tagged. Whereas I'm pretty confident Zack Merrett here is just somewhere between 115 and 140. Like a really safe captain fallback option if your vice captain fails. Number 3, we go to Tim English. So Tim has gotten through what I expected to be a bit of a tough ruck run in. 3 of his last 4 games have been tough ruck opponents, and it now opens up for him for the next 3 weeks. So don't be surprised to hear his name in my next few videos. So Hawthorn were a hard matchup in 2023 when they were playing both Reeves and Meek, but that is no longer the case this year. Lloyd Meek, as solo ruck, wins the hit-out in 40% of his ruck contests in 2024. That puts him in the bottom third in that category, so an easy matchup for winning a hit-out against. But that isn't all that excites me here. I expect Tim's speed and endurance to cause real issues for Meek around the ground in this matchup. At Marvel, under the roof, with plenty of marks available. I mean, there were a few of us in Slack watching Meek last week, and he's a great player, but he's not the most nimble of athletes, and whereas English is, and I expect English to just be able to get what he wants in this game. So English scored 143 against the Hawks to end 2023, albeit that was against Ned Reeves, but it was still, I guess, one of the Hawks' big men playing solo ruck. Meek did limit Grundy to an 83 last week, but in the 3 previous games, Meek gave up a 144 to Tristan Cherry, a 112 to Jared Witts, and a 110 to Darcy Cameron. And none of those ruckmen really have the running power that Tim English does, so I really do think this could be a big one. My number 2 captain option, we go to Max Gawn. So Max has been the best player in SuperCoach this year, and that is not an exaggeration. He's now leading the league in total points and in average score. He's provided a reliable captain option for us every week. And that's not changing this round with a matchup against Geelong at the MCG. The first thing I want to mention is that the MCG isn't really the best ground for ruckmen to score at, or at least ruckmen that rely on hitouts and tackles. So guys like Grundy, Tristan Cherry generally don't do as well at the MCG because big open ground due to less stoppages than some of the smaller grounds. So those ruckmen that need hitouts and tackles aren't as good at the MCG. But for the ruckmen that can get 10 plus marks on any given day, so I'm thinking the guys like Gawn and English, this can be a really good scoring ground for them. The second reason for looking at Gawn here is the Cats matchup. So Reece Stanley wins a hit out in 40% of his ruck contests, as opposed to Gawn, who wins at 48% of his ruck contests. And that 8% difference is considerable in this context, and I would expect Gawn to dominate the hit out battle, which gives him free access to points. Additionally, despite being on top of the ladder, the Cats are actually the easiest matchup for opposition midfielders this season, so there should be plenty of clearances and contested possessions available for Max too. I'm recording this before teams are named, and you might kind of ask, what if Toby Conway comes in to replace Stanley? I mean, it's an option. I don't know if they will, give Conway a game against Big Max. But if they do, while being a bit taller, Conway wins the hit out in 42% of his ruck contests. So it's a little bit better than Stanley, but still well below Gawn. And he'll get out-muscled in any 1v1 matchup. So whichever ruck opponent Gawn gets this week, I'm confident in another big captain score. Even some of the mid-tier rucks scores against Geelong this year, like Pittonet just had 112 against them despite ruck sharing with Tom De Koning. Oscar McInerney scored 53 in only 30% game time before getting injured, and Riley O'Brien scored 116 against Geelong recently. And then 2 premium ruckmen have played them this year. English got a 117 on Geelong. Marshall got a 127 on Geelong. So there have been some very big scores against Geelong this year, and I think Max is going to take advantage. So my absolute prime recommendation, if you can VC this and then captain one of the Bulldogs boys, I would highly recommend doing that. That would be my ideal. But the West Coast loophole plays too early to make that a possibility. So just have a look at your loopholes, see what you can make work. Then we go to my number 1 captain recommendation, and it's Marcus Bontempelli. So here we go. This is a run I've been waiting for to trade Bont in and start looking seriously at captaining him. He's gotten through 3 hard matchups in a row with an average of exactly 100 in those 3 matchups. Now we get to take the handbrake off and let him feast. Hawthorn and Richmond in his next 2. But let's focus on Hawthorn this week. So the Hawks are the second easiest team for opposition midfielders to score against this season. Bont's last 4 matches against them show scores of 115, 122 and 136. And I believe you can add another 130-something if you include this year's preseason game where he barely got into second gear and just dominated them. Hawthorn is coming dead last in the AFL for team contested possessions and team clearances, which would indicate to me that it won't be too difficult for a dominant midfielder like the Bont to extract the ball out of stoppages. In the last month, Hawthorn have allowed 5 midfielders to score 135 on them. That's bad. Recent scores from inside midfielders against Hawks include Chad Warner got a 135, Isaac Heaney got a 120, Noah Anderson got a 155, Matt Rao got a 135, Tuke Miller got a 133, Jordan De Goey got a 138, and even Tom Mitchell got a 119. So I would be very, very surprised if Marcus Bontempelli doesn't join this list this time next week. So Bont is my number 1 captain option because the Hawks are giving up so many points to inside midfielders. So there we go. That's my 3 VC options, my 1 pod, and my 5 captain options. I would mention some other names that you can consider. These guys, they do have favourable matchups, so that's kind of why I've mentioned them. But I'm not as confident in them as the 9 guys I've just mentioned. So you could look at Jordan Dawson or Rory Laird versus Port in the showdown. Dawson loves the showdown. He's got some good scores there. I still just am still not sure that Adelaide have worked their midfield mix out. Laird and Dawson both scored last week well against North, but it could just be anyone this week. Also, Port are one of the hardest midfield matchups in the league. I think they actually might be the hardest over the last 5 games. So this is a real test for Jordan Dawson to see if he is back. You could have a crack as a VC if you want. I think you could look at Tom Green against Sydney. Sydney aren't necessarily an easy matchup for midfielders, but I've already talked about how the SCG is a higher stoppage ground. That might suit Tom Green. Although Sydney moving the ball really quickly like they do might hurt him. So you could consider it. I'm not that big on it. Lockie Whitfield I would actually probably rather against Sydney. Sydney have given up really big points to defenders this year, but Lockie Whitfield he is more of a fantasy scorer than a SuperCoach scorer with his uncontested possessions, so I probably wouldn't. North have given up huge points to inside midfielders this year. 2 weeks ago, I would have looked at Jack Steele, but he just hasn't looked right the last 2 weeks. He had strapping on the knee. There's injury worries. You could look at that. You'd have to be pretty ballsy. Tristan Cherry against the injured Rowan Marshall. That could be a nice little matchup. I don't think anyone will really be thinking about captaining Cherry, but if you do, Marshall is one of the easiest ruck matchups even when fully healthy, so that's an option. Christian Petrarca versus Geelong. This one I actually really do like. This nearly made my list and probably could have. Geelong, as I said, despite being number one on the ladder, they are the easiest team for inside mids to score against. I don't expect them to tag him, although there were times that I believe Mark O'Connor tagged Sam Walsh last week, so he could go to Petrarca, but I really like that matchup. Sean Darcy versus Nank. Nank's been giving up a lot of points this year, so Sean Darcy's an option. Luke Ryan versus Richmond. That's a good choice. I've mentioned Bont versus Hawthorn. You could look at any of the other mids. You could look at Libber if he's back versus Hawthorn. Hawthorn have also given up big points to defenders, so Jim maybe look at a Bailey Dale. I wouldn't for a captain. Could be a fun vice-captain, but he plays too late. And then Gold Coast defenders. Defenders have scored well against Brisbane this year. So I think Sam Flanders is actually a really, really safe 115 if you want. I just think there's better safety and ceiling guys playing around that time. So one comment before I go. I have seen multiple people suggesting that they'll vice-captain Gawn, see what his score is at quarter time, and captain Zack Reid as a loop if Gawn is going well, because there's about a half an hour delay when the Bombers play. The Bombers game starts half an hour after the Melbourne game. So there's people saying, oh yeah, I'll VC Gawn, I'll see what his score is on at quarter time, and then I'll throw the captaincy on Zack Reid. Can I say, please do not do that. Locking in a vice-captain loophole at a quarter time of a game is inviting way too much risk. Your vice-captain could get injured in the second quarter or subbed out if they're winning by 10 goals. Just isn't worth the risk, especially with 3 really big Sunday captain options to fall back on. So either vice-captain Gawn and fall back on one of the doggies guys if you've got the loop, or just go a vice-captain earlier. Don't be trying to do a quarter-time check loop. And as I said before, another reason for me not using my VC on Thursday or Friday is that I can wait to see the Sunday teams. And I need to wait and see the Sunday teams to know whether I have a Sunday loophole. So I've got Kane McAuliffe. He could be my loophole, which would allow me to go vice-captain Gawn, captain Bont. But if McAuliffe's playing, I can't do that. And I think if I can't vice-captain Gawn because I don't have the loop, I'll go VC Sheesel, C Bont and Pelly. So they're my recommendations. I'd love VC Max, C Bont. If I can't do the loop, I'll do VC Sheesel, C Bont. So that's all from me. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. As always, hit me up on Twitter, Dr. Supercoach Slack, or in the comments below. Hope you have a really good week, and I hope you absolutely nail your vice captain and captain this week.